to the Digging the Garden show with Adam Cortell. I'm really excited. Today we have Janet Cassidy joining us. Janet is an expert on food preservation. So how are you doing today, Janet? Welcome.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
There you are. So, Janet, you have years of experience with in the food. Well, you launched the first farmers market in city of Canton, Ohio, years ago, and then you worked for the Ohio Farm Board for years, or Farm Bureau, sorry. And also, you have a blog at jansjars.blogspot.com. And then also, you have been doing Google Helpouts in food preservation. So I just wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you went down that road to becoming the food preservation expert that you are.
Sure. Well, you know, in terms of how I got there, I really started out. My grandfather had a farm, and my dad had an apple orchard, and so I spent a lot of time in both those places, and so really developed appreciation of food production. And so when I went to college, I actually got an ag degree and continued on that path. And so my real passion is growing food. I'm a gardener, and I love that. Also helping farmers become more successful. And also, you know, I personally love to eat the food that we grow year-round. And we, you know, I remember we had so much of it, or it felt like too much at harvest season. And I thought, well, we're going to eat some of it, and then what's going to happen? And so really, I grew up canning now and again with my grandmother and my mother, so I knew that there was a way to preserve. But then as I got older and started my own garden, I really wanted to enjoy those flavors year-round, and not just through, like, you know, December, January, but really year-round. And so that's when I really started to pay attention to canning and go and get my certified master food preserver.
That's right. So before we dive, well, we'll just dive into the basics of canning here in just a moment. But I was just thinking, I have a little bit of the same thing going on where I'm starting to produce enough food that I need to preserve it somehow. So I want to jump into canning. And so I was wondering, like, what are some of the just basics I would need to know to get started with canning?
Yeah, my advice to novice canners is to really think about recipes, and I know that that's sort of an odd place to start, but there's lots of recipes, there's lots of bad recipes, especially on the internet, and so that's really the first place a lot of folks go is the internet when they're looking for recipes for canning. And oftentimes those aren't really vetted or tested recipes. So, you know, canning is really, those standards are really based on the acidity levels in your food, and there's really no way to test acid levels in your food at home, so you really need to rely on those vetted lab-tested recipes. And so my encouragement is always, don't start with a homespun recipe, don't start with a recipe that maybe grandma used, even though you loved those pickles when you were young. Food has changed, foodborne illnesses have changed, bugs have changed, so really get a vetted recipe that's up to date. And when I say up to date, I would say no more than 5 years old. Those standards are constantly evolving, and so really be sure that your recipes are recent.
Now, does that go, is that the same for, like, if you're doing just an open canning bath or a pressure cooker? I mean, can you do different things with a pressure cooker? Is there recipes that, I mean, what should I consider as far as that? Is it still all the recipes should be vetted regardless of whether it's in a pressure cooker?
Yes. So some folks believe that a sealed jar means it's safe to eat. In fact, that just means that you created a vacuum in the jar. It doesn't necessarily mean that the contents are clean. And so you can pretty much get a seal on a jar regardless of acid levels, which doesn't mean it's safe to eat. So to answer your question, whether you choose your method of preservation based on the food that you're trying to preserve, and you rely on the recipe to have been tested to know what acid level that is, and then you use the appropriate canner, and then you process for the time recommended. And that's how you'll have a safe product.
Okay. So I was wondering, like, if I was going to, let's just suppose I have a lot of peppers, right now, hot peppers,
Mhm.
and I want to do some sort of a pepper jelly. I know there's probably a lot of recipes out there, but one thing that I also, well, I've had some green gage prunes, but they're about done. I also noticed that there's a lot of sort of wild plums that grow along the side of the road that have a lot of sugar in them. And I was wondering if, can you think of any recipes out there that would apply to that? Maybe like a wild plum hot pepper sort of salsa that I could can, or
Yes, so there's definitely fruit salsa recipes.
uh-huh.
And off the top of my head, a plum one doesn't come to mind, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just I don't think I've seen that. I would, your extension is a great. If you can't find this in, say, a ball blue book, that's really sort of I think a standard in the industry. I pulled out my ball blue book. I'm not getting paid. There's no endorsement deal here, but that is what this year's looks like. And so really, that's a cheap investment to get some starter recipes. If you don't find a plum recipe or some recipe that you want to make, then really you can go to your extension office. They're also a good source of recipes, and so I think most counties in Ohio have access to an extension office that's linked to the local university, and so they'll have access to more recipes. And so that's a great sort of backup, and those are free.
Okay.
Those recipes are free. So that's actually a great way to sort of utilize the resources in your community for free.
All right. So sounds like for a book, I need to get the ball blue book.
Yep. That's a great place to start. Absolutely.
Okay. So start with that, and then what kind of equipment would I need just to get started?
So I put out my canners. I'm just going to lean over here a second. Okay. So I'm going to hold this up. So here's my that's filling the whole. There we go. So this is my water bath canner. And so it's nothing more than a big pot with a rack inside. Let me pull that rack out. So here, it's hard to see. There's my rack, and that'll actually hold the jars. So you want a rack in there to keep the jars off the bottom of the pan. You don't want your jar sitting directly on the bottom of the pan. And that's really where I tell folks to start. Didn't want that to fall off. That's really where I tell folks to start, is with a water bath canner, because there's not a big investment in that. And so oftentimes people are willing to give those away. If you put the word out, someone's grandma still has one, definitely grab it. There's not much that can break in a water bath canner, and so if someone has one, aside from a leak, it still works. If you need to buy it new, I think I saw them for about $30. So low investment. Then you need to get the jars, of course, and then you need to get the lids. And so start there. If you love it and you want to try some pressure canning, you can get the pressure canner later. You may can and decide that you hate it, and so you've only invested $30. And I'm sure someone else will want that canner if you don't want it. So that's really where I tell folks to start with the water bath.
Well, that sounds like a good plan. Is there any websites that you would recommend that would be a go-to if something is not in the, in the blue book?
There is. I had to write this down because it's sort of a big name. It's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Again, that's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They're associated with the University of Georgia, and they are really doing a ton of research and recipe generation, especially for newer ingredients. So your mixture of peppers and plums might be somewhere in their archive or in their recipe section. And just their website, again, it's a mouthful, is nchfp.uga.edu. Usually I just Google it and it comes up. Okay. So yeah, I don't worry about that website, remembering it. It's too much, but I usually Google it. Yeah. So they're actually pretty great because they're doing really cutting edge stuff.
That's awesome. Okay, well that's a good resource I can go to then as well. I was wondering, like, a little bit, what does your food preservation routine look like each year? So you have, I think, a couple acres, and
yeah, we have probably an acre in production, and then a handful of fruit trees and bushes. I don't know, maybe a dozen or so. And so, every year is different, of course, depending on how the garden went. This year we had a really rough growing season, But typically in our neck of the woods, berries, strawberries are the first thing to can, and so that's where I kick off in June. And pumpkins are the last thing to freeze, and that's where I'm going to end up here in about another week or so. Again, depending on the growing season, we've done as many as 300 jars. We've actually done a few more than that, but I don't like to can more than I eat. And so if you think of 52 weeks, that's 5 jars a week, and it's just me and my husband. We don't have kids, so 300 seems to be about the sweet spot. I think this year, like I said, we had a rough growing season. I bet you we did less than 200. And so we're not quite where we should be, but that's the way of a gardener. And I encourage folks to only preserve what they'll eat in a year. You really don't want to be eating that food beyond a year. The nutrition declines, flavor declines, and while it may be safe, you just don't want to be eating it a year later.
Right. So just kind of plan out. I mean, I have 2 daughters and my wife, of course, so just kind of plan out maybe how much we would need. Of course, first I have to grow enough, so right now that's part of the challenge. So
that's right. So we just did applesauce recently, and if I don't know how often you want to eat applesauce, your girls might love it, and so you want to eat it 2 or 3 times a week. We'll eat it about once a week, so I know I'm going to need about 50 jars of applesauce to get me through the year. And much more than that, we're going to have like an applesauce rebellion here and not want to eat it. So
yeah. So I've been doing some food dehydrating, and of course we have a freezer out in the garage. And so I was wondering, do you do a lot of food dehydrating as well, or smoking, or some sort
I do dehydrating. So if we had a really awesome strawberry year about 2 years ago where we just had tons of berries, and I never ever thought I'd think, what am I going to do with all these strawberries? I've never been in the situation where I had to ask myself what to do with all these berries. And so what I did was make fruit leather out of them that was delicious. So actually we were like 2 adults that were packing fruit leather in our lunches, and our coworkers were like, what is going on? But it was delicious, and I actually love that that fruit leather a lot. So we do that. I also sort of dehydrate, apricots, and we dry a lot of herbs.
Yeah, I would love to have that problem of too many strawberries. Like, what do we do with them? So that's one of my goals. We always just seem to grow enough strawberries to kind of do the walk by and snack, and maybe a little bowl to bring in, but there's never quite enough to preserve. Same with raspberries. So that's kind of I want to bump that production up as much as I can. Yeah,
I think all berries you just never have enough of. Even chucking them in the freezer, there's always something you can do with berries.
Yeah, I mean, you can throw them in smoothies, you can put them on desserts. They're just wonderful. I had a really good cherry crop actually this spring, and we had one tree that was just covered. I mean, it must have had 100 pounds of cherries on it. It was amazing. We ate, and then I froze a whole bunch of them. So
nice.
Probably froze 20 or 30, well, maybe 20 pounds. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, it's good. And then we have a blueberry place we go and pick. So we try to go and get a big, as much as we can pick. It's just hard to make it there sometimes when they're open. And I think we picked about 30, maybe got 30 pounds in the freezer.
That is fantastic.
Yeah. So now I need to branch out into canning. Well, that sounds like some great places to start, and I'll go ahead and research my pepper plum jelly recipe, see if there's anything out there that's
I can't wait to see what you come up with.
Yeah, I know. That'll be fun. We had these green gauge prunes, and they're pretty good fresh, but sometimes they just don't get eaten, so I took some of those and just, cooked them up with a lot of the hot peppers, and those came out really, really good.
And don't forget, if you can't find a canning recipe, you can freeze jam. And you can successfully freeze jam. And so if you feel like, that's sort of the answer to, I want this one thing that I can't find a recipe for, that's totally cool. Just freeze it. Okay,
just go ahead and throw it in the freezer if I can't find the recipe I need for the canning. Well, that sounds great. So, I thank you so much for jumping on here with me today and sharing some canning basics. I really appreciate that. And
you're welcome.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. And if people wanted to find you, where could they find you, Janet?
I'm on Twitter at Janet Cassidy. Pretty original handle there, just at Janet Cassidy. or my blog at jansjars.blogspot.com.
All right. Fantastic. Well, you have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you later.
Thanks. You too, Adam. Bye-bye.
Thanks.